Hey guys, Akiba here from CryptoSlate again. Today I have a fellow Brit with me to talk about infrastructure. It's gonna be a really great one, so stick around. We'll see you after the intro. Let's bring Matt Hawkins in, CEO of Kudo. Matt, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. So, Matt and I met very briefly at Zebu Live in London recently, where I just seen him talk about sort of infrastructure, and I thought it was really interesting. So, we had a bit of a chat and decided to have a podcast and have a chat around it. So, Matt, your background is very much in what in Web3 we'd probably call legacy sort of infrastructure now. Do you want to give us a little bit of your sort of backstory of how you came to be kind of CEO of Kudo Ventures and also what you do at Kudo?
Yeah, sure. I guess historically, before this, we founded a large data center and cloud company. Like you said, Web2 days back in the early 2000s, just as the internet was taking off. And that business, we kind of built an early version of decentralized cloud or decentralized web, really. So we were in
Wow.
over 50 data centers around the world. We could provision data center space, network, cloud, whatever was required really for internet infrastructure. And we ran that for 16 years. But when we were running that, we were just seeing huge waste and empty capacity inside data centers and cloud providers.
Right.
But then at the same time, the hyperscalers, taking market share, and the kind of these middle tier providers, which a big part of the world's internet is still made up of, just weren't able to compete, either from a global coverage or a scalability perspective. So we wanted to be able to build a network to be able to scale really on a global level, to be able to provide distributed compute, both into traditional web capacity as well as blockchain. So that's really, we sold that company to essentially build in software a global network, the equivalent of what we physically had to build ourselves beforehand, but using the available computing, which means you can scale much faster and provide a much better global service.
So you're talking there about decentralization within Web2, which is not really a topic that we touch on much in the kind of the Web3 world, how kind of decentralization or even blockchain technology can still benefit people outside of Web3. Where do you see the biggest sort of growth areas within that space and how decentralization can help Web2?
I mean, Web2, as you probably know, is extremely centralized generally at the moment across.
So is Ethereum, really.
Yeah, exactly. And that is one of the challenges. In the Web3 space, we're trying to be decentralized, but we're not, because over 50% of Ethereum runs in purely Amazon AWS, and about 43% of it runs in America. And that is regulatory risk and also platform risk. So you've got huge risk in a network that's meant to be decentralized. So we kind of need to work in a different way. This is just in the Web3 space. We need to work in a different way. But in the Web2 space, from an economics perspective, if you need scale, you have to go to the large providers, and the large providers know that, so they charge a large premium for it. If you need to run at the edge, which is, if you're running game servers or video streaming or metaverses, where the edge servers need to be very close to the end users. And I say very close, within 100 kilometers or a few hundred kilometers. Then again, these large providers can't provide that. And as 5G improves, as our home connectivity improves, more and more of the computing, where you want an interactive, very fast result, like electric cars, things like this, where they need to make decisions. Internet of Things, which many people have heard of, we need more and more computing capacity at the edge. So we sort of computing kind of goes through 20-year cycles, moving kind of centralized and decentralized, and it sort of follows this, and it's been doing that since the 60s. And we're kind of going to that point of going through the decentralized and distributed back to the edge again phase at the moment. So it's needed in both spaces, Web 2 and Web 3.
Yeah, I mean, you see, I don't know, like one region of AWS, like say like West Coast or East Coast of the US goes down, and like 50% of web services also fail at the same time. Is that therefore also something that you're looking to sort of solve for by decentralizing computing power?
Yeah, so I mean, you essentially decentralize your risk from a platform perspective. So if you went to a platform like ours, for example, on the Kudo network, where let's say you want to run a blockchain or you want to run a metaverse, you don't want that centralized because, like you said, especially on the blockchain side, single points of failure, you should never have. Well, even from a worst case scenario, you should never have more than a third of your network with a single service provider. Actually, you should never have more than 10% in a single country or a single location. That's absolute worst case. And it's rare that a blockchain actually meets those requirements from a risk perspective, because if all of a sudden 10, 20, 30% of your blockchain goes down, or sometimes, even in Ethereum's case, 50% could theoretically go offline if all of the services went offline. That next block, 50% of the voting power is gone, and that can cause a problem in a lot of the blockchains that are out there.
What are your thoughts? I'm not sure whether you're happy to talk on this, so feel free to pass on it. But we're talking about centralization, and with the US there, I think a really interesting point is, I think also we recently just passed 51% of validators that are also now running something like flashbots, which are OFAC sanction compliant. As a UK citizen, those sanctions technically shouldn't apply to me, but on the Ethereum network, I can't avoid it. Do you think that the US has too much of a stranglehold on Web3 at the moment?
I think the risk is probably more regulatory than anything else, rather than geographic. I think the likelihood, in reality, the likelihood of the internet going down across the whole of the US is extremely lower. The likelihood of the regulatory risk is much higher.
I mean, from a regulatory point of view, given that, say, like more than 51% of validators now apply the compliance tooling required by OFAC, they're US sanctions. They're not UK sanctions or European sanctions. Yeah, in order now. And for me, it's not about, in all honesty, that I'm as invested in Tornado Cash or definitely like terrorist organizations, but it's more the precedent that it sets, that it's now a thing.
Yeah. And you've got OFAC, you've also obviously got SEC, and where they're, like you said, the majority, and it doesn't have to be 51% as well, it can just be the largest entity is what they're looking to have. So like Ethereum is, the last record I saw was 43%. Is they're saying, well, that is actually the largest single country entity as a number of validators on that network, which by default means that should fall under US rules. So even it could be 20%, but if the next country is 15%, that gives potentially that country to try and put in the rights and their regulations, like you just said. So it's a huge risk because many of these blockchain projects specifically are avoiding the US as well, because the regulations are still being defined. And many projects may fall outside of the rules of those regulations. So when you're trying to build a project, and specifically not make that project available in the US, but now the SEC or other regulatory body is saying, well, it doesn't matter whether your customers are in the US. The fact that you're running on a platform that we're now saying is a US platform means that you can fall under those risks is a really big global problem.
Yeah, and I think that's why I think you're right with the percentage of validators in the US, but there are validators outside the US that are using, like, basically, if you're using flashbots for your MEV, they're OFAC compliant. Therefore, like, it's not quite at a protocol level, but it's half a step above, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting area. But you have there's three aspects, isn't there, to Kudo? There's the Kudo's blockchain, there's the Kudo miner, and the Kudo cloud, GPU cloud. Are they three separate companies, or are they just more services that you offer?
They are three different services, but they're all part of the same group and the same company. So the benefits really all roll into the same token holders. So we've been building these different platforms which service different markets. So Kudo Compute is designed to service the traditional cloud computing market, which is 82 billion a year market. That if you think of infrastructure in your traditional blockchain space, it's growing at an incredibly fast rate, but it's still very small. So there's lots of metaverse projects and blockchain projects, but from an infrastructure spend and capacity perspective, it's still in its really early stages. But the traditional infrastructure market, has been around for 25 years. We can directly service with our compute platform about 25 to 30% of that market. So it was designed to use the same technology, but to be able to service your traditional markets, which means we can scale much faster. So our average customers on the compute platform spend between $1,000 and $250,000 per month on cloud. So they're big spenders in this space, and that's what we want because we're building out this global compute network. Whereas if you want to consume compute from the blockchain side, they're much smaller spend, and they're probably in the thousands of dollars per month. So I think but they're scaling up, as these get big.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting area to be looking at. So utilizing essentially blockchain technology, but for non-blockchain based projects, which in reality, when you look at the size of the market, like it's an obvious aspect. The part that I would then wonder is what sort of feedback or resistance have you had, if any, from web2 projects when they then find out that there is blockchain involved in your solution?
If you go in with the blockchain angle, they're instantly kind of turned off, as it were. Partly because they don't understand it and can't relate. They're going, well, I just need infrastructure. I don't need a blockchain solution. So this is why we have to build a platform that kind of abstracts that away. So we've got an API, a GUI, everything that you would expect if you were buying Amazon or Google or other cloud services. And the fact that it's using blockchain under the hood is completely irrelevant to them. And if you look at some of the best projects out there, quite often, if the fact that you can't tell it's using blockchain underneath and it's as intuitive as web2 solutions have been, that means you've done a good job, really. So that enables really us to service both those markets. So you're right. If you just go in, then we looked at other infrastructure projects in Web3, and when they've gone in directly with the Web3 angle, that traditional market just doesn't understand it, and they'll go, "No, I'll stick with what I know."
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas where in some of my consulting that I do alongside, it's a similar thing that I feel we actually kind of need to stop talking about blockchain as much as we do, at least. Given that one, it started to receive, I think, the wrong perception by the sort of legacy media, and also due to just, I'll say, a lack of understanding. And in like Web2 projects, you don't lead with, oh, we've built this new app using PHP or whatever the best. You definitely wouldn't say that, but that React Native or whatever. It's like, oh, that's the reason why you should buy this. Well, no, the reason I should buy it is because it'll do something good for me. What tech you're using is likely irrelevant unless it's a tech person that's then interested on the bit of the core. Do you think that's something that Web3 businesses are just going to have to swallow and start doing, or do you think there'll be a point where blockchain becomes the buzzword again, as opposed to like the boogeyman in the room or the elephant in the room when dealing with tech?
I think the name, or the kind of perceived value of blockchain goes up and down with the market. In reality, especially for the people that don't understand the correlation between the two, or non-correlation between the two. One's a technology and one's, a token. but it's a little bit like how you look at what happens with the S&P when the market goes up and down. The companies that are still making great profits and nothing's changed in business will still drop a third like the rest of the market because they just get dragged down, and it works the same with Bitcoin. So it's kind of nothing new from that perspective. I think it will be, at the moment, it's a little bit like I remember in the 90s when I was watching on a morning TV program, people were talking about, what is the internet? And they were going, why do you need email? I've got a fax machine. And I think we're still going through that education process for a lot of people. And now when you build something, they don't go, oh, well, why are you doing it on the internet? And I think we're literally just going through that same process of education. It depends where you are in the world. If you look at places like Nigeria, over a third of the population hold crypto. I think we're coming around 10% of the UK, but over 50% of Gen Z. So we're just going through the stage of growth. I think that it will then become the norm. And I think if you look at kind of so I started, my company just after the dot-com crash, the last business. And I kind of felt like that was the equivalent of 2017, where every project was raising and we went through it. But then those following 4 years or so was when kind of the real projects started to get built. And then the following 5 years were where those real projects started to take off. And they're all the big brands that you know today. And I think we're going through that cycle. So I think over the next 5 years, it will just become part of the technology and everyone's building on it. But we're still sort of in that early education stage.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think one of the things that is most obvious working both in media and also talking to developers pretty much on a daily basis is interest in crypto projects changes with the market from a media and retail point of view. But I've not seen any sort of downturn in enthusiasm from developers and builders. Like there's just more problems to solve. We need to solve interoperability, we need to solve UX, and we need to solve the sort of the onboarding problems. I think are three areas that you're seeing most, and like general security, I guess, in some aspects. They're the things where I'm seeing loads of innovation, loads of development, and then obviously underlying all of that, it's the core infrastructure. Like we need proper core infrastructure for it to grow. And like you said, I think everyone that's maybe at least spent 5 minutes on crypto Twitter these days knows that too much of Ethereum runs on AWS. Like that's just a well-known fact. But what does it take for people to care enough about that to make a change? Because if the business itself is running on AWS, they haven't yet had any major problems with that. How do you find the way to kind of claw them away from it and sort of make the case for decentralization?
So if it kind of falls again into Web2 and Web3, if you go into the Web2 space, generally there's two types of compute. You've kind of got your core HPC, which is like high performance computing, and you've kind of got your edge computing that runs in locations around the world. For core computing, the real benefit is either price, and because we're running in this spare capacity essentially, or available capacity, then the economics are much better for them. Or it's the ability to scale in resources that are quite constrained quite often, because if you look at things like graphics cards, it's actually quite difficult to get a lot of scale of graphics cards resources in hyperscalers at the moment. Just because of the silicon shortages is one of the main reasons, but also the demand in the market's going up. If you look from an edge perspective, that's actually very difficult to get edge locations around the world. Like the hyperscalers, if you look at Amazon, for example, it's in 22 core locations. So they can service a lot of the core regions, but let's say you're building, even a Web2 metaverse platform, because they exist as well. They don't have to be built on blockchain. You need to be within 20 milliseconds of the end user, which is kind of a fifth of how long it takes to blink your eye. Otherwise, they just don't get a good interactive and immersive experience. So the need is there to provide edge, and they can't currently get that from the core providers. So that's actually a really important need. And then that's probably Web2 is those two main areas. And then from a Web3 perspective, well, the whole ethos of being distributed and decentralized in the first place Secondary, you shouldn't be with single providers anyway, just from a risk perspective. And a lot of these projects are new, so they're building new platforms, and especially, it's probably less of a concern for a Web2 project that everything's running in Amazon. But from a Web3 perspective, if you've built a blockchain, there's no way a blockchain should all run in a single service provider. So the way that you build these platforms needs to be completely different. And even if you're building your own platform and bootstrapping it, if you're bootstrapping and testing in Azure or Alibaba or a single provider, whoever it is, you don't get any real world experience. You don't get any real world metrics. You don't get the latency and the connectivity you need around to simulate these real environments. So this is what you're seeing with some of these other projects when they've lab tested a new blockchain or a new design, or they've customized Cosmos SDK or something like this. They deploy them, test them in a simulated private environment. You put them out in the real world, it's completely different. So as just from a pure builder's perspective, building kind of the layer, even the layer 0 or the layer 1 layers, up to building applications, where you want that infrastructure to be serviced as low connectivity around the world. Those are actually high needs rather than just wants.
Yeah, because I imagine if you're cutting off any time to market for them, then you're making them potentially X percentage in revenue before not having to go back and do more beta testing and bug fixing.
Yeah, exactly.
It sounds kind of interesting. You're talking about sort of network availability, because that kind of reminds me of a lot of what some of the Bitcoin miners do around energy, where they're using unused energy resource and then selling back to the grid at other times. So are you kind of doing like a similar model, but with infrastructure, by using like available services that would otherwise be redundant?
Yeah, we've got two elements actually. One for the compute part is where service providers, they can run it in two ways. They can run it on their spare capacity. It will make all of that capacity available into the marketplace. Or they can actually connect their orchestration, which is a provisioning software. They can connect that software into the system, and then it will read all of their available infrastructure and make that available. So that kind of makes everything available that they own into this global compute network. But then when you talk about on the mining farm side, we're actually launching tokenized infrastructure, which is where, as well as being able to use the network to rent capacity, you can actually own capacity. So we're wrapping that up, the ownership of infrastructure. We're working with renewable energy mining farms. That's the first one that we are launching with. So we're working with projects in solar farms, even carbon negative projects as well. We're working with them to enable them to kind of tokenize their capacity, and then people can buy that on the open market. So it gives them a yield off their Bitcoin, really. And from a farm's perspective, it means that they can finance their infrastructure and expand better. So you kind of get, as all of our platforms are supply and demand networks, then you get the benefit.
So you tokenize the hash rate there, essentially.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And then that's moving on to compute and other infrastructure afterwards.
Well, I mean, it sounds all absolutely fascinating, and it's an area that I'm super intrigued with, because I'm completely with you in the fact that blockchain as a technology tool shouldn't just be focused on in the ways that we currently are thinking about it in terms of Web3 and DeFi and all these great ideas. But so private blockchains are a thing and have a use in the world. Like, not everything has to be open source and public. There are good uses for this technology, and I really like the way that you're going about it. And obviously, with your legacy, with the sort of traditional infrastructure, I think it's super exciting. Is Kudo a UK company, or is it like an American company? Or
yes, yeah, the team is decentralized, kind of based around Europe, US, South Korea, India. So we've got the team kind of around the world. But we started in the UK, and it's originally registered.
So I can fly the flag for the UK around
That's
the
it. Yeah.
I want to say, someone says, "Well, what's the UK doing with crypto?" And obviously, there's CryptoSlate. Although Nate's just moved to Lisbon, as everyone is, which I think is a really interesting point.
I'm still based in the UK.
I mean, one last question maybe before we wrap this up is, What do you feel about the UK crypto scene? And I will throw a little one in there. In that, do you think has your perception changed of the future with the new prime minister?
Okay. I would say the scene is pretty healthy from a blockchain perspective. There's a lot going on in the space. I do think where you've seen kind of tax benefits such as Dubai across kind of Middle East or Lisbon, where they've brought in tax benefits, and all of a sudden Lisbon's kind of become the blockchain hub of Europe, as it were, and then Dubai's managed to achieve the same. So we're not at that level, but there aren't the tax benefits, and kind of companies follow the tax benefits in reality. But I think we do have a pretty good framework in place. It could be better, and I think there's a fair amount going on in the industry. As to relate to the new prime minister, I've not heard any policies from him on his view, so I'm not quite sure. I think anyone that is pro business, pro startup, pro innovation, in theory, should be pro this industry.
Yeah.
So then, he claims to be, but whether that is the case or not, we will see.
I think that's definitely an education area. I was watching the What Bitcoin Did podcast this morning, and Pete McCormack made a really great point in that, like he said, in the US, progressives should be getting behind Bitcoin because it's a progressive idea. But at the moment, there is a lot of pushback around sort of the energy consumption. There are some valid concerns there. I think there's also a lot that are misconceptions around the way that proof of work really works. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting time in the UK crypto scene. I'm interested to see what happens next. What were your thoughts on? Did you manage to catch Matt Hancock's talk, Zebu?
Yeah. So there was some delays in the times, and actually he got my slot and we swapped places.
Oh yes,
So so I was partly preparing for mine, so I only picked up some of his. Actually,
the one interesting thing was on the back of, just in all honesty, from my point of view, the only interesting bits were in the Q&A at the end. The rest of it just seemed like him trying to make sure he gets re-elected, in all honesty. But in the question at the end, he did say that he believes that the UK would benefit from essentially looking for the potential future gains in crypto by encouraging crypto in the UK, rather than the gains we can get now by taxing it the same as we tax any other asset. Therefore, kind of between the lines saying, if we do what Portugal's doing, we'll have a more thriving economy in the future, and we can then tax it at that point. Is that something that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean that's exactly the approach, like you said, Portugal and Dubai have taken. And if you look at the number of startups, companies, employment that's going in behind this, these areas are growing hugely. And the fact that, and it's in those early years that you're building projects that you kind of need those tax benefits, and the same as any startup, really. So definitely, agree with that purpose. I think providing a lot more for support as well for these types of companies. There's a lot of startup support in the industry, which you have like the local commerce startups. You have in different regions. A lot of government advice, but there could definitely be more in this space. I'd say if you look at us compared to the US, we're in a much better position, because anyone building in the US is, there's a reason, most projects are avoiding the US, but then if you're building in the US, your regulations are so tight that it's very constrained in what you can do, and that's going to constrain innovation. So.
Yeah, or at least kind of there's a sense of nervousness, I think, in the US around they just don't know what could happen. Whereas I feel like there's maybe a little bit more understanding in the UK. It feels like it's small, gradual changes rather than one big sweeping thing that tomorrow they're going to ban Bitcoin mining. Is that the sort of sentiment you share, or?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I mean, I don't think actually many people are physically mining in the UK, but there's companies that are certainly based over here. But again, that's an understanding thing as well, because as with any technology, and you look at the early days of the internet as well, that got abused and then it became much easier to control it. It's the same in Bitcoin mining. More of it is going renewable, but then actually a lot of new projects are being used to fund expansion of additional renewable energy locations and solar that wasn't financially viable before, which is then being used in the local area. And we're working with some projects where we're looking at actually launching the farms in those areas that are used to, then the profits are used to regenerate the area and bring in education and employment.
Yeah,
so there is a lot of good that you can do with it as well.
Yeah. I mean, Bitcoin has the potential to go 100% renewable, and therefore, then what does the argument become against Bitcoin when you have a potential global monetary system that relies on the sun or the air or the wind or water or geothermal or whatever to power itself, and that's all it needs? Like, that's an incredible feature, and that's for me where we should be pushing in terms of policy, like incentivize to go renewable or de-incentivize to be carbon based. Well, I'm super excited now. You've got me sort of pumped for the UK crypto scene, in all honesty. If anyone wants to know more about Kudo, where would you recommend them go? Should they just go kudoventures.com? Is it Discord? Is it Twitter?
Yeah, the Kudo Ventures is more of the kind of general overall business, but kudos.org is actually our blockchain site. On there, you can link to our Telegram, to our Twitter. If you're on the development side, try building applications, on the chain. The compute is live now as well. So if you want to try and build some compute projects, we are going to be doing some challenges, some world records and competitions. So cryptographic challenges, things like that will be coming out over the next couple of months. So just sort of subscribe on there. And if you like building stuff, then get involved.
Brilliant. Right. Well, Matt, thank you very much for your time today. It was an absolute pleasure. I'm going to roll the outro in a second, but just stick around in the backstage area for 2 seconds. But for this episode of the SlateCast, guys, thank you very much for watching. And thank you, Matt, for joining us today.
Great. Thanks.
Bye. And